Welcome back to Intro to Web 3223. We're going to be talking about front-end tools this time. So one of the things I've mentioned a little bit up to this point is that most of your work is going to be done with some sort of a tool set or a tech stack is what people would call it. So I've referenced Bootstrap a handful of times up to this point, and this is the lecture where I'm going to expose you to a handful of these. Do be aware that there are quite literally hundreds of these tools, and I'm going to show you a handful of the popular ones. All right. So first and foremost, a front-end library is a tool that allows you to create new things a little bit faster. This comes at the cost of understanding what that library is actually doing, and it becomes more about learning how to do the dance of the library more than how the technology itself actually works. So there's definitely two camps on that, and it definitely fall under the camp of if you can do it natively, you probably should, unless there's a reason to not do it that way. And then the other camp is, well, who cares about native? Just learn the new library and get the work done as fast as possible. And that is something much closer to what a business would do and what people get rewarded from a business standpoint rather than from a technology and understanding and just technical proficiency standpoint. Okay, so you take that as you will. I'm not going to limit you either way, but it is out there. The other thing that we need to talk about is that there's two different flavors of tools and front-end tools and libraries and so on and so forth. And one of which is opinionated. The other one is unopinionated. So opinionated means we are going to force upon you a set of rules that we think are appropriate for what you're trying to do. The problem with this is that if you're going to use something like Angular, we'll talk about that. Well, Angular is only so good at particular things because it doesn't allow you to customize very well. And trust me, they try, but it is a opinionated framework. They will stop you from doing things that they would consider poor practice. And unfortunately, sometimes a poor practice is exactly what you need to get the product out the door. So yeah, take that as you will. Unopinionated frameworks tend to be, well, one, lighter, because you don't have any types of checks and balances. It's just kind of use this function, use this middleware, and it does a thing for you. And then those type of libraries tend to be helpful for a lot of people like me or other senior developers that have a reasonable idea of what's going on. And they can just make the thing without having the framework get in the way. So we'll go over a few options right here, and then we can talk about some of the pros and cons between all of them. So opinionated frameworks, if we're talking about just JavaScript, because there is a bunch of languages out there, and it seems like every single language has 4 or 5 of these popular frameworks. So if we're talking about just JavaScript, Angular, talked about that a little bit. It's based on components. It is a full frame framework or a full stack framework, and it is it's based around components. Okay. It is opinionated though. Angular has quite the learning curve to it. Takes a little bit of time to actually get good at it. React, technically a library, but is getting ever so close to being a framework. It's still technically a library at this point, but what React is trying to do is, again, based on components, purely on the front end though, so there is no server-side language for React. But what it's trying to do is force you to use the React library so you can create a bunch of components. So React can render the DOM for you. Okay, so at least with React, the opinionated nature comes from a functional advantage where they are trying to render the DOM for you. Now, this obviously comes with its own problems. I ran into a problem the other day where I couldn't dynamically assign options to a dropdown, because every time you try doing that, it's going to force the DOM to re-render just because of the way React is set up. So, I mean, there are always conditions where if you have an opinionated framework, it's not going to work for a particular condition. Every single time you go down the opinionated route, you're going to de-optimize for something else. Okay, Next.js is really, really cool, actually. It is a React framework with a backend, a very similar backend methodology. And their claim to fame is going to be microservices. So you don't even have to think about how to do that if you're going to use this framework. And then it uses React on the front end if you want to use React. And then if you want to use components on the server, then you can do that as well. And there's very React and flavor doing those components. So you can get server-side rendering React style on a server, which is cool. And this is a relatively new framework. Vue.js, think of it as React, just a little bit different, a little bit lighter, a little bit faster. Doesn't do as much though. Okay. Onion opinion frameworks and libraries. So Bootstrap, talked about it a bunch. Materialized, very similar to Bootstrap. Anime.js, so that is just bringing a library and it does animations for you. D3, so graphical data. Highlight.js, code styling. Moment, you kind of get the point. I'm just reading off the slides at the moment. So libraries, especially from a JavaScript standpoint, essentially it takes other people's work and then you just call their work, you call their functions, and it does a thing. So if you're doing something like TensorFlow, which is AI based, do you necessarily want to recreate TensorFlow? The answer is no. Okay, so there is arguments to be made for libraries, especially when someone has went out of the way to make a thing that would take a long time to get to the same standard. There's not much of a reason why you wouldn't use a library at that point. The argument is with a lot of developers is that, especially in the business environment where you have a lot of real pressures, there's a lot of people that have just gotten so used to bringing in a new package that instead of trying to figure out that problem on their own, they just go straight to npm and download a package, and it doesn't matter how small it is. So it becomes, a lot of developers are becoming glorified data plumbers essentially. They don't really know how to program anymore. So here at First State, at least, we're going to try to pull back the curtain to show you what's happening behind the scenes and get you to the point where you can flip between, okay, I'm just going to download this package and use it, and then over here, if I actually need to make something, we're going to be able to do that. Okay, so that's going to be it for this one. It was relatively short, something that we wanted to go over, we want to expose you to. Definitely use this as a reference, and then later on in the project we'll use a couple of these, probably Materialize, maybe Bootstrap. If we get to a project where you guys want me to recreate something that involves data, we'll use D3. So yeah, it just depends on what the Alfred State students want me to recreate. So with that said, that's all I got for this one, and I'll see you in the next one, which is front-end practices. See you then.